This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to the good, the bad, and the ugly. Directed by Sergio Leone, starring Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week we are revisiting the movie that we began the show with for its 40th anniversary this year, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Harrison Ford, Karen Allen, and John Rhys Davies. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Also, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes, you can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Additionally, did you know that our website has the full notes for every episode of the show as well as the master list of movies we've graded so far? There are links in the episode descriptions of every episode to direct you right there. Check them out. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. With that, we welcome a new guest to the show, writer, director, and occasional actor, coming to us all the way from Tehran, Iran, Ali Khamseh. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I hope it will be a good one.
We hope so as well. Ali, with all new guests to the show, we like to ask a few questions to allow the audience to get to know you. So first up, tell us a little about yourself, what you do, and why you love movies.
Well, I'm a student of cinema. I've studied cinema for the last couple of years in university. I'm a writer, director, occasional actor. I mainly work in short movies and independent movies for the time. I'm hoping to move up at some point. And the reason I've become infatuated with movies is because from a very young age, I was interested in storytelling. And, well, not to actually show my bias fairly early, but when I saw The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly the first time, I realized written words are not enough. I need to do movies. I need it deep in my heart to tell my stories using motion pictures. And that's where my love and, frankly, obsession with cinema came. And it's been going on ever since. I've spent a lot of time going through cinema history, watching as much movies as I can, absorbing all of this knowledge, and so far I've managed to pay tribute to a couple of my favorite eras in cinema in some of the short movies I made.
That's awesome. And I know that you were saying a little bit before this when we were kind of just talking ahead of the show, but you even learned English through the movies?
That is correct. I learned my sort of broken English through watching movies, in particular Jeremy Irons and Christopher Lee movies, British movies, which is why my accent is kind of messed up, because in my head I'm trying to imitate the way they spoke.
Okay. Understood. Second question we normally ask is, what is your favorite movie and why?
Well, again, I'm sorry for coming in all biased, but it's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it's because, well, again, it's the movie that got me the feeling that I need to make movies. I think it's the perfect movie in every way that I want, in terms of storytelling, editing, rhythm, character, cinematography, and music. It's a perfect blend of everything that I personally love and enjoy in movies.
So then the final question that we normally ask, what makes a good movie for you? I think you've kind of given a few hints, but if you could really narrow it down to what elements of a movie are really most important to you when you're trying to look at something for its quality?
Well, firstly, I look at the story. It's maybe because it's my profession. I'm first and foremost a writer, but I always look at the story first, characters second, and how the story is told through the visuals. I think if you find a good balance between there and you don't sort of give too much attention to one of them at the expense of the others, you get to create something phenomenal. And there are other factors there too: editing, music, acting, certainly. But I think the biggest pillar that makes a good movie for me is the balance of story, visuals, and characters. These need to be in a perfect harmony. And some of my favorite movies of all time, I think, managed to find that balance quite good, like The Godfather or Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Okay, yeah, that's one that we haven't heard on the show a lot, but definitely I can understand that. All right, so let's jump into the movie then. And gentlemen, let's start here. I know we are going to measure this movie's greatness by the end of the show, but I've often said that greatest, best, and favorite are three very different things. Is this the best Western of all time?
I mean, it's the best spaghetti western of all time. I think it's hands down the best spaghetti western. Whether or not it's the best western of all time, I think is a subjective thing, because spaghetti western is somewhat in a gray area of western genre. For me personally, spaghetti westerns are the best kind of westerns. So for me personally, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the best western ever made. But I can understand why, for a lot of people, it's the more classical westerns, like the John Wayne ones, that they enjoy more, because spaghetti westerns are sort of an antithesis on them.
When you're looking at this, it's different than any of the other types of westerns that kind of came out of the traditional American 30s, 40s, and 50s, even the television genre, because the western was just a tool for good versus bad. And the good were always really good, and the bad were always really bad. And there was no subtlety many times. This, everybody's flawed. Even the good, Clint Eastwood in this film, is really kind of a scoundrel. You know, he's going to leave Eli Wallach in the desert to die because he's just annoyed with him. He shoots people for no good reason sometimes. And so this brings nuance and more realism to westerns more than any other western, I think, to this point. And I guess the question is what do you want? Do you want the classic good versus evil, or do you want the more realistic view of life, which is there is no such thing as a totally good person, and there is no such thing as a totally evil person? So, to that extent, I would say this reflects more reality than any other Western. So, if that's what you want, I guess to me, that's why this is probably the best Western, because it really did make that differentiation.
So, other ones that I know people would put in the bunch. We're talking about High Noon, which is high on our current list for greatness, let alone for just best. You're talking about maybe a Rio Bravo, but that's kind of more in that second tier, I would say. The Searchers is often mentioned, and I would say that that's pretty much a precursor to what we get with some of the Sergio Leone movies of the 60s and the spaghetti westerns when you talk about Carbucci and some of the others. You might be able to put in a couple of the other Dollars trilogy into this category that might be nominated. I know that you and I personally love The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance as one of, I guess, unheralded westerns. The Wild Bunch is often talked about. Unforgiven. If you want to play some of the more modern ones, then you're talking about No Country for Old Men kind of being in that category. But I look at this in a lot of ways. Even though Leone started it with, I think it's Fistful of Dollars was first, and then For a Few Dollars More is second. I think this is really the bridge Western. And what I mean is while we have more anti-hero characters, much more complex, we still, even from the title, are given really what the sides are supposed to be in this movie. The good, the guy we're supposed to root for, the bad, the guy we're clearly supposed to root against, and the ugly, the one where we don't know what we're supposed to do with him. And by laying it out so specifically, even from the opening, you still get a bridge or a mix between the moralistic American Westerns and this new era of anti-hero Western where everybody is kind of a rascal. So I don't know if it's best. I would say it's definitely in the running, and I think it might be one of the most iconic.
If I could mention just a sort of a side note here, I don't know if this is something that is going to come up or not, but it's also in many ways, in my research and understanding, sort of a precursor or sort of a grandfather to postmodernism. And I think that's where the bridge sort of manifests itself, because it's taking everything from the westerns that came before it, like High Noon, like Searchers, particularly Stagecoach, and sort of you can see the way it balances itself better in Leone's next Western, Once Upon a Time in the West. But there is a sort of madness in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly that I think is more reminiscent of from the newer movies in Quentin Tarantino movies or Robert Rodriguez movies. Like, there is a unhinged madness in it that is very reminiscent of postmodernism in cinema, which is something that, to be honest, is my field of work. I work in postmodernist cinema, so I'm sort of grateful for that too, because without The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, without Sergio Leone and all of the spaghetti westerns, I don't think we would have had postmodernism in cinema.
To be fair, Clint Eastwood is also a perfect vehicle for this, given that this basically becomes the essence of his career for the next 40 to 50 years. He's been playing the man with no name, whether it's Dirty Harry or it's Gran Torino or whatever you want to say down the line. Even to a certain extent, Million Dollar Baby, he's playing this character again and again and again throughout the course of cinema and getting rewarded for it. So I think that, again, this is kind of one of those movies that's on that pivot point, much in the same way that we've recently talked about Jaws, where you're blending the difference between what classic or old Hollywood was and what you're going to get in new postmodern, as you mentioned it, cinema as we go forward. Now, one of the other things I'd like to mention as we kind of move into the other parts of this movie is this has one of the most known musical cues, I think, in all of film history. Where does it rank, I guess, in that for you? I would put it up there with probably Jaws, Star Wars, Raiders, and maybe a couple of others. But I don't know if there are too many other musical cues that are as iconic as the coyote howl.
To be honest, the extent of its power can be seen from the moment that if you want to make a Western reference, you just go to the opening theme. And there is no other musical cues that tells you this is a Western, we are going to do a Western. I put it really up there, as you mentioned, with Jaws. I put it next to Halloween theme from John Carpenter's Halloween, because I think that is a pivotal horror soundtrack. Like, you want to make a horror movie, you do that soundtrack. And The Godfather for Mafia, of course.
I know that it's not one that would normally come up, but since you mentioned horror, even the knife scene from Psycho, if you have that like high piercing shriek, that is iconic in itself too, although it's not necessarily noted as a musical riff. But Dad, I think you would definitely agree on the musical choice, given that it's your ringtone.
Yes, it is. And I love to do it because it's whenever it goes off, everybody goes, "Is that the good, the bad, and the ugly?" I've never had anybody go, "What's that?" It's always immediately they know the film just from those few notes on the ringtone. And it's not my ringtone, it's my message tone. So it only plays about 5 notes and people still pick it up.
Yes, I think it's the thing that everybody knows the most from this movie. I guarantee you there are probably half of the general audience that has never seen a single moment of this movie, but knows exactly that musical cue.
And just sort of quick mention, because we lost him recently, Ennio Morricone passed away last year, and to be honest, it was such a crushing blow to me emotionally that just rewatching the movie again, I kind of got emotional at the opening credits because I realized, oh my god, we lost Ennio Morricone.
We're going to go at length about his score for this movie. There are just some absolutely stunning pieces of music in this movie. I can't praise it highly enough. But before we get too far, what is your relationship to this movie?
This is one that I can tell you exactly the first time I saw it. The ABC Tuesday night movie. Sitting down with my dad and watching this on commercial TV in about 1974, 75, somewhere. And my dad just sitting there and like, watch this scene. Watch this scene. See this. Because that was like high level of communication between he and I, because I used to comment that we could be in a room and bond by osmosis because he would say maybe 2 words the entire time.
If he said watch this scene and was making note of it, given that he is the patron saint of this program, that's notable.
Yes.
Ali, what's your relationship to this movie?
Well, I think I sort of explained it already, but I first watched it in 2012, I think. I was 15 at the time, and I just watched it. I watched it at 11 p.m. I watched it twice that night, slept for a couple of hours, woke up, watched it a third time, and said, fuck the written word. I want to make movies, because before that I wanted to be a novelist, and I said, no, no, this is what I want to do. And I never looked back since.
All right. So before we get too much further, Dad, do you have a plot summary ready for us?
I do. In 1862, during the American Civil War in the New Mexico Territory, a mercenary known as Angel Eyes, played by Lee Van Cleef, discovers the existence of a stolen cache of Confederate gold. Bandit Tuco Ramirez, Eli Wallach, and Blondie, Clint Eastwood, also stumble upon the secret gold, buried in a cemetery, and create an uneasy partnership to find the gold. The three struggle to get to the gold, enduring hardship, betrayal, and violence. Who will win? Will anyone get the gold?
Thank you. Cast for this movie: Clint Eastwood as Blondie, the man with no name, or the good. Lee Van Cleef as Angel Eyes, the bad. Eli Wallach as Tuco Benedicto Pacifico Juan Maria Ramirez, known as the Rat, according to Blondie, or the Ugly. Mario Brega as Corporal Wallace. Antonio Casale as Jackson/Bill Carson. Ido Jeffrey as an alcoholic Union Captain Clinton. Luigi Bistilli as Father Pablo Ramirez. Recognition for this movie. It is listed in Time's 100 Greatest Movies of the Last Century as selected by critics Richard Corliss and Richard Schickel. Quentin Tarantino has called it the best directed film of all time and, quote, the greatest achievement in the history of cinema. This was reflected in his votes for the 2002 and 2012 Sight and Sound magazine polls, in which he voted for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly as his choice for the best film ever made. Its main music theme from the soundtrack is regarded by Classic FM as one of the most iconic themes of all time. Variety magazine ranked the film number 49 on their list of 50 greatest movies. In 2002, Film 4 held a poll of the 100 greatest movies, on which The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was voted in at number 46. Premiere Magazine included the film on their 100 most daring movies ever made list. Mr. Showbiz ranked the film number 81 on its 100 best movies of all time list. Empire Magazine added The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to their masterpiece collection in the September 2007 issue, and in their poll of the 500 greatest movies, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was voted in at number 25. In 2014, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was ranked the 47th greatest film ever made on Empire's list of the 301 greatest movies of all time, as voted for by the magazine's readers. It was also placed on a similar list of 1,000 movies by the New York Times. In 2014, Time Out polled several film critics, directors, actors, and stunt actors to list their top action films. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly placed 52nd on their list. Did you know? The three principal actors are the only ones who speak actual English in this movie. Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, Eli Wallach, with the exceptions of Al Moloch, the one-armed man, and John Bartha, the sheriff. Everyone else in this movie is really speaking his or her native language, mostly Italian and Spanish, and was later dubbed into English. Did you know? Ennio Morricone's iconic theme music was designed in places to mimic the sound of a howling coyote. However, Morricone did not want to use the trumpet, but Leone insisted. Along with the electric and acoustic guitars and the Tarzan yell, the trumpet became the most distinctive part of the soundtrack. Did you know? According to Eli Wallach, when it came time to blow up the bridge, Sergio Leone asked the Spanish army captain in charge to trigger the fuse, as a sign of gratitude for the army's collaboration. They agreed to blow up the bridge when Leone gave the signal "Vai" or "Go" over the walkie-talkie. Unfortunately, another crew member spoke on the same channel saying the words "Vai vai," meaning "It's okay, proceed," to a second crew member. The captain heard this signal, thought it was for him, and blew up the bridge. Unfortunately, no cameras were running at the time. Leone was so upset that he fired the crewman, who promptly fled from the set in his car. The captain was so sorry for what happened that he proposed to Leone that the army would rebuild the bridge to blow it up again with one condition, that the fired crewman be rehired. Leone agreed, the crewman was forgiven, the bridge was rebuilt, and the scene was successfully shot. Did you know? When the bridge is blown up and Tuco and Blondie are hunkered down behind the sandbags waiting for the explosion, Clint Eastwood's career came within 2 feet of ending prematurely. A fist-sized piece of rock shrapnel from the explosion slams into the sandbag right next to Eastwood's head. Watch it in slow motion the next time to see the rock flying in. Did you know? Because writer and director Sergio Leone spoke barely any English and Eli Wallach, Tuco, spoke barely any Italian, the two communicated in French. Did you know? Tuco's line, "When you have to shoot, shoot, don't talk," was improvised by Eli Wallach, which apparently caused the whole crew to burst out laughing. Eli was a little perplexed because he thought what he had said was actually pretty sensible. That is, he didn't mean it as a joke, but his delivery and the look on his face made it side-splittingly hilarious. Did you know? In addition to the train scene, Tuco, Eli Wallach, cheated death in the first scene where Blondie, Clint Eastwood, shoots him down from hanging. The gunshot scared the horse, which took off running at full speed for nearly a mile. Wallach's hands were tied behind his back and he had to hang on for dear life with his knees. Did you know? Eli Wallach was almost poisoned on the set after drinking acid used to burn the bags filled with gold coin to make them rip open easier when struck with the spade. He didn't know that the acid had been poured into a lemon soda bottle. He drank a lot of milk and filmed the scene with a mouthful of sores. Did you know? When Tuco is having his handcuffs cut off on the train rail, writer and director Sergio Leone insisted that Eli Wallach perform the stunt, assuring him that while it would be loud and scary, it would be totally safe. Wallach was unaware of the low-hanging step rails, which missed his head by a few inches. In the wide shot, the step that would have hit his head is clearly visible. Did you know? When Eli Wallach arrived in Madrid, Spain, all of the hotels were full. Clint Eastwood invited him to sleep over at a friend's house, and they shared the same bed. Wallach's wife, Ann Jackson, later told him that he could boast that he was the only man to sleep with Clint Eastwood. Did you know? Sad Hill Cemetery was a very convincing set piece constructed by the pyrotechnic crew and not a real cemetery. Today, the site is marked as a local point of interest. In 2015, a group of fans created the Asociación Cultural Sad Hill, and they restored the whole place. The central stone proscenium, parapet, and the circle of graves. In order to attract additional participants, they were invited to prepare their own graves and put their own names on the crosses. When complete, an event was held with one of the film's producers present and with film greetings from composer Ennio Morricone, Metallica frontman James Hetfield — Metallica uses the Wallach grave seers as video before it shows — and from Clint Eastwood. A feature-length documentary was made about this project titled Sad Hill Unearthed in 2017. So, gentlemen, with all that being said, what is this movie about? Ali, we'll start with you.
I think ultimately, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, aside from its cinematic thesis, which is Western is not supposed to be white hats versus black hats, basically good versus bad, is ultimately a story about greed and just general hard life on the frontier. There is this running theme of the immorality of the war, which is kind of hard when it's the Civil War, where the good and the bad is basically quite clear. One side is fighting for slavery, but the movie really blurs that line. And
Well, in America, that's not the case.
oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking as an outsider.
You'd like to think that the sides are clearly defined. They're not as much depending on whom you ask here in the US.
Sorry, as an outsider, the morality seems very clear to me. But even a war as clear as Civil War is not very clear in the story. It's it's about greed. These three people are not better than each other. Like Angelise is not a morally inferior person to Blondie because, well, they're all scumbags. They all cheat, lie, shoot people, kill people for no reason. They are selfish and greedy. But what we are supposed to, I think, get from that is it doesn't matter how greedy you become, it's about who shoots the last shot. It would have been a completely different story if Angelise had killed Blondie.
Yes, very much. I do agree that it has a sense of nihilism to it, and particularly, I think one of the best written exposition scenes from the movie, because most of this revolves around action. You don't really get it until about halfway through the movie, but it's Tuco and the exchange he has with his brother. I got out because I had to, and I had to choose this life because it was the harder path. You took the easy way out by becoming a priest and being the moralistic, upstanding one. And so it kind of gives an extra layer of what is it to be moral? Is it necessarily the most difficult, or how do you balance those two things? That maybe being the more moralistic is somehow cowardice.
The one part that I thought was the most interesting is that Tuco is ultimately betrayed, and the deck is stacked. So he thinks he's in the fight, but he has no bullets. And so that to me is not just, even though we know that there's these people are greedy and they're going to cut throat and try to. No, Tuco is there like a lot of people in these contests. And he thinks he's on equal footing, but he is completely overwhelmed.
Absolutely. So then, best performance. Dad, let's start with you.
I went with Eli Wallach. I think his character was the most funny, the most entertaining. I read in some of the preparation pieces that the character was based in large part on Leone, that he kind of wrote it about himself more or less. And the Tuco is the bandit was Leone fighting against the cinematic norm in Europe at the time. So there was a connection there. So the part itself was great. I really liked Wallach. For whatever reason, Wallach is not or never really got the kudos that Eastwood did, despite the fact that he had a, what was it, a 70-year career or something like that.
Sounds about right. Allie, where did you go for your best performer nomination?
I mean, I have to completely agree with Dana. I went with Eli Wallach, and because I think he has the most nuanced performance of all three. I'm sorry for knocking him down, but Leone had a saying about Clint Eastwood. He said, Clint Eastwood as an actor has two expressions, with hat and without hat. And I think it's kind of a missed, not missed opportunity, more of a injustice that Wallach never became quite that big of a star. When his role was the most taxing, he had the most nuanced performance, as I said. All of the little intricacies in his movement, the way he even doesn't have a pistol belt, he puts his gun in his pants pocket, which is a problem that Wallach apparently had. He couldn't put it in a pistol holder holster. I'm sorry, but even that gives his character like a new layer. The way he smiles, the way he talks, the way he jumps up and down. He's overexcited, but he's extremely dangerous.
I absolutely agree. I had to really rank my choices. I thought there were several great performers in this. I didn't nominate him for Best Performer, so I'll go in a slightly different direction. And I couldn't feel out how to nominate him for Best Secondary Performer. I just had two Titanic guys just ahead of him. So I gave him my most charismatic because I'll put it this way: you're trained to root for Blondie throughout the course of the movie, but you love the movie because of Tuco. So I actually went for my best performer for Maricone. Simply put, he just enhances every single part of this movie. The opening scene, while shot well, and that's why I gave Leone essentially, I gave him my best secondary, but you could say it's 1B in best performer. I had a really hard time separating between Maricone and Leone as the best performer in this movie because I thought they really worked well in concert. We've talked on this show a lot about the pairing between John Williams and Steven Spielberg, but I think this is as good a pairing between composer and director as you could possibly find. The iconic score of looking for gold in the cemetery and that spinning, and I just got dizzy with the whole thing, but you're so elated and ecstatic because that background music is just playing with the almost choir like angelic nature of trying to find the goal. Or you talk about the final standoff and the tenseness of that scene, but just amplified that much more with the pounding, driving score as we're continuing on. And at every point in this movie, there's like a needle drop where most other people, and while I understand and enjoy those that kind of take the Martin Scorsese approach of putting pop songs, I still think that there's nothing like having a really good composed piece of music that you can needle drop right in the middle of a movie. And there might not be a better movie to do that than this. So I went with Maricone for my first one. But again, I don't want to give short shrift. Leone got my best secondary performance because he worked so well with the music as the cues. You talk about that last gunfight. The tension is there because he keeps narrowing the camera view to focus in on specific parts, their faces, then back to their gun belt. And it's just the hand movement, slowly, slowly. And you're just waiting. And he waits the exact right amount of time to give you that incredible tension that you know it's going to come. You know the draw is there, but who's going to draw first? How are they going to end this whole thing? And even as many times as I've seen this now, you still are just waiting for it to end slightly differently. And that's the mark of a master filmmaker.
To be honest, I kind of echo your sentiment. For my secondary performance, I went with Ennio Morricone. The reason I didn't put Leone there because, to be honest, Sergio Leone and the good, the bad, and the ugly is so intertwined for me. It felt like giving the movie the best performance. It's like it's Sergio Leone. It's nobody else is there. It's just Sergio Leone. He's doing what he does best. I mean, he made 6 movies, all of them Ennio Morricone composed music for, and all of them have such an amazing relationship with their music. And so I went with Ennio Morricone. The scene you mentioned, which I mean, the ecstasy of gold scene of Tuco running in the graveyard, technically, academically, based on Sitfield, it's wrong. It shouldn't exist. It's a scene where nothing happens. It's a scene that has no emotional bearing in the story by itself, like on a paper. But it doesn't matter. It works in the rhythm of the story, it works with the music, and because of that music, it works. I can't imagine any other song, any other music, or even any other composer writing for that scene because I can't really imagine a John Williams orchestral epic track going there or Neil Young because of Dead Man, Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man solo guitar track going there. It just needs Ennio Morricone, and it works because of the music. Like, there is no way that scene would be that impeccable without the music. So Ennio Morricone gets my best secondary performance because he's behind the camera and my eyes is usually drawn towards what's in front of it.
I will say, I can't imagine what this was on a large screen perspective because I've only ever seen it on, I guess if you could say it's small screen, but 42 inches or slightly larger American TVs. But even then, the twirl of the camera during that just makes me dizzy, and yet I'm still suffering in some level of an angelic choir. And I don't know. There's something about that scene that I love almost as much, if not more, than the standoff itself. There's just that pursuit there that I guess ecstasy is the right word for it. Dad, who did you go for your second best secondary performer?
Oh, I'm being a little bit of a stinker. I went with Leone and with Morricone because I just didn't want to make a differentiation. The fact that the music so wedded with the shots and Leone with the extreme shots. That's the part that visualized with the music, going from the extreme close-ups with just portions of the face to broad wide angle shots and then back again and back. Just the sheer cutting back and forth like that creates a level of tension in and of itself. And then when you start adding in the music itself, and there's not a lot of music in there, it's not orchestra, it's like only a few items of music, a couple of instruments, a voice, so that it's very raw and clear and clean. In combination with the sparsity of the visual, it blends so well together. Sometimes, like a recipe, you don't need a lot of ingredients, just a couple are enough to make the recipe or the food excellent. And that's, I think, ultimately, it's a starkness, both visually and musically, that makes it blend so well together.
So I already gave my most charismatic. Dad, where did you go for most charismatic?
Well, simply because I went with Eastwood. He became a star from this. It was clear he was a star. And I guess that's the question. And I have this by profession, Ali. If you were, I'm a lawyer, so it's always a question of, do lawyers become lawyers because of their personalities, or do their personalities come from being a lawyer? And with Eastwood, I don't know if he became the character or the character was Eastwood, but he's been pretty much the same. You listen to an interview now with him, and he is this gruff, silent, not too many words type of person. And I don't know. I don't know if again if it's him or he has become the character.
But we could say that of a lot of different actors. The amount of range or that they can lose themselves in particular characters is not common. We just like their excellence for being able to play shades of themselves. Case in point, as you've mentioned many times, either Jack Nicholson or Tom Hanks. They play a lot of the same roles over and over and over again, but they're just really good at playing that role. Clint Eastwood found the exact right character for himself and played it, whether it was Dirty Harry or you want to talk again about Gran Torino or Unforgiven, any of these characters, it's the same character, and now he's going to do it again for Cry Macho, apparently.
Well, and you could even you could put some of the lines from other films into The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and they would have worked perfectly. Go ahead, make my day. I mean, you could have put that in the middle of the film. It would have been like, oh yeah, yeah, you know.
Yes, I completely agree. To be honest, for my most charismatic, I went with someone a little bit of a smaller role. I went with Idol Jeffrey as the alcoholic union captain because the first moment he steps out and he's tumbling and he opens that, I suppose it's rum or whiskey. I'm sorry, I don't drink, so I don't really know what would be appropriate there, but he drinks it, and I'm just hooked based on just that initial performance. Even though he has a very small role, he's one of the parts of the movie that I remember vividly every time I watch the movie. It's like, oh, it's that scene. The way he sort of asks the doctor, "Can you keep me alive for like a couple more minutes?" I'm expecting really good news. There is just something about his performance. So I went with him with most charismatic because much like Marlon Brando in The Godfather, he's in so little of the movie, but he feels such a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think between him and I think it's Mario Brega as Corporal Wallace, they have two really great heat checks in this movie. They're in it for such a short time but leave such a lasting impression. And you find that a lot in really good character actors. So it's an off the beaten path nominee, but certainly one that fits the bill. Let's go to best scenes. I'll start with this movie, other than a few towards the end, doesn't have scenes so much as sequences. There's a lot of stuff that if you tried to limit it to one scene, you might be losing a lot of what the character of that sequence is. So I guess my first sequence for nominee then is going to be the Blondie and Tuco racket with the hanging and claiming the reward. That kind of opens up the movie and really tries to escalate with the exposition without telling you, but showing you exactly how immoral both of these characters are.
I agree. I went with I tried to limit it to scenes, so I went with the original opening, like the very first opening of the scene, which is three bounty hunters going into the bar to kill Tuco. That I mean, for me personally, that's the best opening to any movie ever. It just hooks you immediately. Okay, what is going on? Who are these people? And who was the guy that jumped out of a window holding a bottle of alcohol and a leg of turkey?
It's such a slow building scene. The only quibble or complaint I would have with it, and I don't know if you watch a lot of movies with other people, but I have a few particular members of my family that would, for the entire buildup of that scene, because there's at least a good like 5 minutes before they even enter the bar, would just be asking questions of who the hell are these people? Why are they going in there? Why isn't anything happening? And would annoy the absolute living tar out of me.
Doesn't take much.
I know. My movie watching is sacred, and they don't respect that.
Well, how about you, Dana? What was your best scene?
I like the whole sequence with Angel Eyes, with Stevens and Baker, and the whole sequence just shows how just absolutely horrible this guy is. He doesn't care about anything, anyone. He's just out for himself. The fact that he shoots the guy and then shoots the kid coming down, like the kid was going to do anything. He could have just pointed the gun and the kid would have backed off. And even if he didn't, he could have always shot him. No, he just, kid turns around, shoots the kid dead. Mom, well, what the heck? You know, you just lost your husband and your son. Have a good day. See you later.
The next one that I had down was Tuco and Blondie finding Carson. The juxtaposition of all of that, because you don't expect Blondie to really come out of nowhere, and really that first part of that sequence where the Confederate stagecoach is coming out of nowhere is a really Tuco dominated scene. But he's first trying to keep Carson alive, and he's so comedic in doing that. Tell me, talk, water later. And then, no, don't die, Blondie, don't die. Or just a great mashup of his desperation and comedicness in doing both of those things. I thought it worked really well, and it really does set up the MacGuffin of everything else for the rest of the movie.
I went with the beating of Tuco scene in the Union prison because that is one hell of an emotional scene, which I didn't expect from a movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There is another very emotional scene, but I will mention that later. But this one was so heartbreaking, like these soldiers who have to play music because they know If they don't, they're killed. But as long as they're playing music, they think comrade is being beaten basically to death in that room. It's such a powerful scene, and I didn't expect that, to be honest, from this movie. Like when I first watched it, I thought, oh, it's gonna be fun, goofy, and then it hits you with that.
And the violence is so sudden and stark in that scene. It's difficult to encapsulate all of the different things that go into it. Dad, what else did you have down?
I also had the Union prison, but I went with the scene specifically between Angel Eyes and Blondie, where it was kind of like, well, I didn't kill you or torture you because you wouldn't have broken anyway. So what difference does it make? So I guess we'll just team up now. I mean, it just absolutely turns on a dime. Where there's an old country song, and Kenny Rogers and the Gamblers made a life of knowing how to read faces. And Angel Eyes' entire thing is just sizing up a man and knowing who you can torture to get what you want and who you have to bow to and team up with to get what you want. And that's what he ended up. He had immediately sized up both men and knew what he needed to do in order to get his desired result.
All right, so the next one that I had down was Tuco escaping from the train. Normally, when you look at a movie, there's usually, especially in something that's well written, one character that they may not highlight specifically, but takes on the characteristics of the audience. And I actually think that it's Tuco in this because he's so overmatched for most of the movie that this is maybe the one scene where he proves that he's just as capable as Angel Eyes or Blondie in being able to use his opportunities and his ingenuity to escape from a terrible situation. The other time where he gets out of this fickle situation, it's more of his menacingness and his ability to overpower an old man in the gun shop. That's not really telling you that he is capable of being on the same level as the other two guys. But the scene where he specifically takes out, I think it's Corporal Wallace or Captain Wallace or whatever it is, and basically kills him, then is able to get the handcuffs off in order to pursue the gold yet again. You notice that he has a little bit more to his character and is more capable than you ever thought before that scene.
And it's kind of funny because of the cliche, I think, that he keeps threatening Corporal Wallace that I'm going to get you. And because of how the movie has gone, you think, oh, he's not gonna, he can't do anything. But then, to quote another movie, he did it. The madman went and did it.
So what's your next one then, Ali?
Mine is, it's the last one I put in for the best scene, but it's kind of obvious. It's the Mexican standoff. It's the point where the movie comes together. The 2 hour that we spent before that sort of culminates in this one incredibly intense moment that just, I mean, even after all these years that I've seen it, and I've seen this movie start to finish 40 times, I think. And I'm not even exaggerating. I really did. It still gives me goosebumps to sit there, and I know who's gonna shoot who, but it still draws me in.
Well, and especially the interplay of I'm going to write it on this rock, and then there's nothing actually on the rock. And he always seems to have the upper hand. It really plays into the character and what you're expecting of that character the whole time because you assume that Blondie's going to win in the day or in the end, but you don't know exactly how he's going to get there. I think this movie actually has two specific peaks, and it's one of the great momentums of this movie. It has kind of all of the introduction that's slowly building towards its first peak when you get to the Bill Carson discovery and them setting off to actually find the gold. Because up until that point, two of the three aren't even pursuing the gold nor know anything about it. But once you get that, this has a downhill momentum towards that second peak that you don't need a lot of building action, but has a very sharp rise into that scene. And I think that that works in juxtaposition of the other scene that I wanted to nominate from that, because I'll separate the two, and we talked about it already, The Ecstasy of Gold. I just love that one. So I'll nominate that one here because I just, between the music and the camera movement and all of the things that go into it, and everything that you're feeling to that point. You don't know that the standoff is coming because Angel Eyes hasn't caught up with them yet, but you do know that, okay, we're getting to the ending, and this is a moment of escalation, that they somehow meet the moment with the score. So, Dad, what was your next one?
I just love the last scene, which is the gold's laying there. Tuco's got his head in the noose. And you don't know, is Eastwood just going to run off and have the laugh that he's so close to getting the gold and he's going to die with it just out of his reach? Or is Eastwood going to turn around and shoot the rope off and let him live? And it's just, I just love that scene because it so summarizes Tuco, because his whole life he's just that close to the money and he just can't get there. And he's on the edge of death with the money right there. And so it's just like that's his climactic scene of life. Is he going to get it or is he not? And so I love that scene. Ultimately, the rifle shot, and then him screaming, "Blondie, you are a son of a..." Yes.
Yes, and we won't do the call on here because that might break the sound on this. But if neither of you have any others to nominate, I had two more. Blowing up the bridge, I do like it as a sequence because, again, that's building. But it's the one like redeeming scene for both Tuco and Blondie, that they're doing this weirdly selfless act, and yet for entirely selfish reasons. That they want to blow up the bridge to basically move everybody away from the fighting. And yet they recognize that by blowing up the bridge, they're doing two things. They're going to have easier access to getting across the river for the gold, and they also know that they're going to take away all of the needless fighting over something that is not going to actually end. They're just going to end up killing more of each other. The other one that I had was, and I think it's probably one of the best gun battles in the movie, but them walking through town, Blondie basically recognizes Tuco's bullets or his gun and figures out a way of getting over there. Then they take on all of Angel Eyes' crew and just gun them down one by one by one. And it is very reminiscent of most older westerns, that the good guy is just running his way through town, kind of like High Noon a little bit, and figures out a way of winning the gun battle in the end, as they're doing the one thing that, if you're going to win a gun battle, don't walk down the middle of the street. Like, it's such a weirdly cliche movie trope, and it makes no sense whatsoever.
And they get lucky. The first guy actually misses the shot. The first guy on the balcony, if he hadn't missed his shot, Tuco would have been dead by then.
Oh, absolutely. All right, so favorite scene then. Ali, let's start with you.
Well, my favorite scene is Tuco and Blondie walking down the street. It's the moment that no matter how many times I watch this movie, when it gets to that scene, um, the exact moment that Clint Eastwood says to Tuco, "What? You're gonna die alone?" and Ennio Morricone's music comes in. It's the moment that I do like Kevin McAllister Home Alone. Yes, like yeah, the two good guys are teaming up to beat up a whole bunch of faceless henchmen. And it's such a peak of, I think, hope in a movie that is very nihilistic, that I just can't help but feel a sort of a surge of energy, like, oh yeah. And it's at a very good time in the movie. It's at the halfway point, so it sort of like charges your battery to go on and keep watching the rest of the movie.
Dad, what did you have down as your favorite?
The Mexican standoff. It's the most iconic scene. It's the most indelible. I'll tell you that's mine right off the bat as well. It's just the scene that I love because you just know. I mean, in American culture, the Mexican standoff has become more a part of the lexicon of the culture than anything, and it's because that scene just works so well and is so well done.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I'll nominate that one in conjunction with The Ecstasy of Gold as my favorite. I just love the ending of the movie in totality. Everything from about that moment where you get the cannonball shot at Tuco to the absolute ending and the coyote call or whatever to end the movie. That whole like 20 minutes is probably my favorite part of the movie. And I'm waiting for about 2.5 hours just to get to that moment, but it makes it so much worthwhile for the other 2.5 hours to get to that point. It is also somewhat in my most indelible as well, so I'll kind of lead into that. I think if this were the general public, and I think I need to nominate it as well, but the music would be the most indelible thing. We kind of already talked about it, particularly the theme song. But given that there are commercials being made with some of the other songs in this movie, I can't push those aside either. So I think the music is the most iconic generally, but to me, the standoff, especially because the standoff's been used or homaged in a lot of other movies as well. You talk about Reservoir Dogs has a clear homage that Tarantino has made and talked about in interviews. There's a Mexican standoff in the U.S. version of The Office for no good reason. It's just randomly it pops up in so many different places. So to me, that's the most indelible and my favorites.
For me, I don't know if we can nominate another one for favorite scene, but it's the meeting between Tuco and his brother, and then when he sits in the carriage and sort of talks about, yeah, my brother, he loves me, he's crazy about me. That is another one of the emotional scenes that I talked about, and it's a scene that I think gives more humanity to Tuco than I think anyone expected this basically immoral, cheating, lying character to have. But it has a very deep heart to it. Like, at that point, to be honest, you kind of get it. Yeah, I would have been the same guy if I were in that position.
Let's take a quick break and we will be right back. All right, welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. Dad, do we have anyone to remember this week?
Yes, Marky Post, actress from Night Court. There's something about Mary, and the Fall Guy passed away earlier
Today.
today. Brad Allen, stuntman and Jackie Chan protege, had been in Gorgeous, The Accidental Spy, The Tuxedo, and Mr. Nice Guy. Herb Schlosser, former NBC president who proposed the idea for Saturday Night Live. And Trevor Moore, actor comedian from the Whitest Kids You Know and Ms. March, passed away this week.
Yeah, we had quite a few this week, and it was a bit surprising that they get kind of sandwiched all together. Like there's either an unusual bunching of them, or we have like none at all. So it's unfortunate that because a few of them passed away at quite young ages. I think Brad Allen was only in his mid 40s, and Trevor Moore I think was 41. But Herb Schlosser was the president and then CEO of NBC during the 70s, and he was responsible for a lot of late night decisions, but particularly the Saturday Night Live proposal at the time. And so we remember him, especially because how much Saturday Night Live has contributed to culture, not just in TV, but in movies overall for a lot of things. So we certainly remember all of these four for their contributions fondly and give them a small moment of silence. All right, let's move to best lines, funniest lines. Ali, this was your choice of movie. We'll let you start with the first one.
Well, the best line for me, which is actually the background to my laptop, is you see, in this world, there is two types of people, my friend: those with loaded guns and those who dig. You dig. It's great.
It's such a Tarantino comedy meets violence type of line, and this movie is just full of it.
Yeah. Another one that is sort of like that is from the Union captain: whoever has the most liquor to get the soldiers drunk and set them to be slaughtered is the winner. It's such a bleak but kind of comedic line. I can't help but laugh, but I don't want to laugh at that.
Dad, what's your first nominee?
This line was used or mentioned earlier, but when you have to shoot, shoot. Don't talk. I mean, the minute that was said, I quick grabbed my journal and I wrote it down because, boy, that line I can use so many different times.
Oh, it's perfect. And it's the most anti Western line of all time. Frankly, it's the most anti action film quip of all time. How many guys have to give the bad guy villain speech and then end up losing in the end because they had to tell you their plan in some grandiose monologue? You could say that for every fucking James Bond movie.
No, Mr. Bond, I intend for you to die.
But let me tell you what I do exactly, and then I'll kill you. I'm sorry. When you have to shoot, shoot, don't talk is actually a line that a lot of professors use for screenwriting. Okay, why is your character talking? When you have to shoot, shoot, don't talk. Just show us.
That's another good use. I certainly anticipate that coming up many, many more times now over the course of our show. The Man with No Name. Every gun makes its own tune. Feels very much the cliche of a Western. Allie, you're up.
It's again a small line from a small character. The bounty hunter at the beginning of the movie says, "Hey amigo, you know you have a face beautiful enough to be worth $2,000." It's such a odd way of putting that phrase that I think at that moment I realized, yeah, an Italian man wrote this.
Dad, what's your next one up?
Eastwood's snarkiness, such ingratitude after all the times I saved your life.
Next one I had down. You may run the risks, my friend, but I do the cutting. We cut down my percentage. I'm liable to interfere with my aim. But if you miss, you had better miss very well. Whoever double crosses me and leaves me alive, he understands nothing about Tuco. It's another great exposition line where you think about two scoundrels between each other and where they certainly cross. Because a lot of that line, while said early on, comes up again. Whether it's Tuco surviving the desert, then coming back to basically torture Blondie, but then he needs Blondie alive. There are so many ways that that kind of interweaves the course of the structure of the script going forward after that. Allie, I think you were up with a nominee. Do you have any left?
It's a big one. It's the one that I laughed at the most the first time I saw the movie. Tuco, God's on our side because he hates the Yanks too. Blondie, God's not on our side because he hates idiots also. That that whole scene sequence of the soldiers coming and then coming closer and dusting off the dust. It's so perfect. It's so comedically amazing, and yet it's important to the plot.
Oh, absolutely. And you don't necessarily expect it until it happens. Dad, do you have any other nominees?
If your friends stay out in the damp, they're liable to catch a cold, aren't they? Or a bullet.
Tuco, you never had a rope around your neck. Well, I'm going to tell you something. When that rope starts to pull tight, you can feel the devil bite your ass. Interesting way of describing it.
Yeah, it's oddly visual, which I did not expect. Mine is Blondie. I'll sleep better knowing my good friend is by my side to protect me.
Dad, do you have any others to nominate?
No, not offhand, I guess.
I only have one more, and I thought of you a lot, even though he's only talking to a chicken. If you work for a living, why do you kill yourself working?
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. Allie, did you have any other nominees?
It's my last one. It's Angeli's saying while looking at Tuco being hanged. Even a filthy beggar like that has a protecting angel.
Very true in most westerns.
It's kind of odd and kind of good for me because I also like to write in English, but it feels like it's not written by a native English speaker. But it works. It works in infallible ways.
I certainly can't debate that. Gentlemen, are we ready for the Stanley rubric?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, let's go to the first one, Legacy. It's usually a little bit easier. We'll ease our guest into kind of how we do a little bit of the scoring, but recently, Dad, you and I have been dividing the legacy score into two parts, half of it based on the industry, half of it based on the audience. And I think this movie has ended up taking a larger status, I think is the best word for it, in the culture, especially in the industry, the longer we've gotten away from the initial reaction. I think that there's a lot made of the fact that initially most people just simply didn't respect international films, and we've had that a lot on this show so far in some of the international films we've covered. But as time has grown out, and we see that with our guest today, that especially in the last few years, but even in the last 20 to 30 years, international film has gotten a new recognition within the larger scale of Hollywood. And I think people are more likely to come around or be fascinated, appreciative, curious about international film. Now, I know this was primarily made for an American audience, but it still is made, with the exception of the three stars, by an international director, an international composer, and an international cast. And so, while at the time I wouldn't say that the impact or significance was huge, I think the legacy is much larger, particularly for the industry that respects a lot out of this movie. So I gave it a 5 for the industry. My problems creep in from the audience. I really don't know how many people have seen westerns, especially that are under the age of 30 or even under the age of 40. I know that there are a lot of iconic ones that we like to talk about, but how many of the great westerns have been made after about 1970? Unforgiven, maybe No Country for Old Men. And I know we're having a bit of a renaissance right now where we're translating the Western theme into other, I don't know if you want to say genres, but fantasy concepts. The Mandalorian is very much a Western set in the Star Wars universe. And so a lot of people are enjoying that, if you can call it a renaissance. But I don't know from the general public how many people know or have watched this movie. I think they know of this movie, so I got to give it some points. Again, we mentioned the music, so I'm going to give it an extra half point just for that. But I'm going to land on a 3 only for the audience because I don't know how many people are really familiar with Western canon or this movie. So I ended up at an 8 total. Dad, where did you come down?
From a legacy point of view, first off, it created Eastwood as a major Hollywood star. It also reestablished the concept of the Western and the good versus evil characteristic within Hollywood. And not just the Western, but I think it showed the flaws of, or it allowed you to have more flaws, or to show more flaws within characters. So I think this had a huge legacy from the Hollywood side. As far as the public, and I know your comment about westerns in general, but the fact that the music, you can play just a few notes and almost everybody knows what it's from, even if they've never seen the movie. The fact that the Mexican standoff is such a cultural phenomenon. I mean, the number of times, for example, I'm just sitting in the dining room and our two dogs and your grandfather's dog are staring at each other with a bone in the middle. And of course, everybody immediately goes, ah, a Mexican standoff. And that to me says this film is larger than the film itself and has taken on a more iconic status. And so I went with a 4.5 on that. I can't give it a total 5 because instead of people watching this for the root of it being the whole concept of good versus evil and that story, putting it in the context of a Western, I think turned some people off. But so I gave it a half a point down from there. So I'm at 4.5. So I have a 9.5.
Allie, where did you go?
I mean, this is where kind of my zealous bias comes into factor, but I try to be as impartial as I can. For the industry side of it, I gave it a 5 because honestly, as I said, it's the grandfather of the postmodernism cinema. Basically, every now and then you will find a movie that in some capacity tries to reference it, whether it's even an animated movie like Rango, which even has the line, Rango, you dirty son of a crow skull. And so I gave it a 5 because I don't think there is much movies like this that had an impact even back then, even though a lot of people didn't appreciate it back then. Again, spaghetti western was supposed to be an insult, and they didn't give it enough appreciation then. But I always say this to a lot of people. In 1964, the four movies at the box office were My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, Doctor Strangelove, A Fistful of Dollars. Like, these four movies that have seemingly nothing in common, but people went and saw this bloody western, and it gave a genre that could have been dying by then. Like, the biggest western back then was The Magnificent Seven, which actually Eli Wallach is in that too. So it sort of reinvigorated this genre and gave it another life, and it got it to Unforgiven, The Triumphs of a Man Called Horse, all of those movies. As for audience, again, I agree with you that not a lot of people watch westerns. I'm the exception that sort of submits the rule. I'm 24, but I watch. Western is my favorite genre. But I think if anyone has seen one western in their life, it's probably The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's sort of this bigger than life, as Dana said, moment. You cannot escape the Western genre, whether in Mandalorian, whether in Logan, and you cannot escape the good, the bad, and the ugly in the Western genre. Because of that, I don't know how decimal we can get. I gave it 4.75, but I'm willing to bump it up to a 5 and give it a perfect score.
Okay. So, which way did you want to go? Do you want to go the full 10 or do you want to take that quarter point off?
Well, my zealous bias says go full 10, and honestly,
So, we're going to go with that instinct then.
just for the magnitude of the music itself, that the album is one of my favorite musical albums of all time.
We're here to have fun. So, at the end of the day, go with your gut instinct. The average then between the three of us becomes a 9.17. So, let's move to impact significance. And I came down in a lot of the same ways because I think in order to understand the legacy of this movie, you have to know the short term impact significance. The Western genre was kind of dying out. You read anything about this movie, and this was coming at the tail end of when the Western was at its peak or most popular, which was about late 50s, early 60s. And as far as some of the most popular Westerns, again, after about 1970, you just didn't have them or the clamoring for them from the American public that you did a decade before. So you have to take that into consideration. This is one of the last great ones outside of, I guess, we've mentioned a few of these, but Once Upon a Time in the West, The Wild Bunch, or Unforgiven years later. But a lot of those take on the more anti-Western approach that I think this is a bridge movie toward. That they're much more violent, they're much more anti-hero. They are not the classical John Wayne westerns, although even some of the John Wayne movies at the end, you talk about True Grit, or I'm trying to think of a few others here. They just didn't have The Searchers would be another one. Didn't have him as the
The
clear
Man Who Shot
classic.
Liberty Valance.
Maybe I could make an argument one way or the other on that one, but he's a little bit more of the white hat even in that one. The clear definition of what the good versus the bad is. There's a quite notable bad in that movie, and I can't think of the actor's name.
It's Lee Marvin, I think.
Yes, thank you, Lee Marvin. But we are getting to the point where I know that the critics' reviews were incredibly harsh, and quite frankly, most people shat on this movie when it came to reviews, at least in the United States. And that was the definition of what movie culture was at that time. But even so, we still got a franchise that basically took and ripped the Man with No Name and made him Dirty Harry, what, 5 years later? Not even. So if we're looking at impact significance as the short 5 years jump from one to the other, Hollywood was interested in starting to do more of these anti-hero types, that we got the counterculturalism. And this fit the bill, even if it was in a genre that wasn't the one that everybody was clamoring for. They were moving toward more towards the classic crime dramas of the 70s, whether you talk about Dirty Harry or Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon. A lot of those movies of the 70s, French Connection, are a lot more anti-hero types and are gritty and grimy. Mean Streets is like that, where you get a lot of this. And again, despite this being a genre movie that you can't make direct correlations, I think the tone overall is impactful. So I ended up going with a 3 for the industry, because I don't think you can deny how disrespected this was at the time, but it is still impactful. So I kind of got a waver in the bridge there. And I think it was more impactful than we probably give it recognition for. I might be able to be argued into a 3.5 on that end. For the audience, this had a meager reception. I don't think it was one of the best box office movies of that year. I don't think it was aided by the fact that all 3 of those movies came out in 1967 in the States. So within one calendar year, you had the entire Dollars trilogy. So it maybe hampered a little bit of the box office from that, where we're moving a little bit away from the Western genre, and people weren't as familiar with Sergio Leone as a major box office draw. So maybe that cut into it a little bit. I ended up going and splitting the difference at a half, with 2.5 for the audience. All told, that's a 5.5 for me. Dad, let's start with you. Where did you go with impact significance?
Well, and this is a borderline question for me, because we talk about legacies being the broader and the impact significance being the more immediate. Well, how immediate? Because there's another film that you're missing that was, again, almost they took the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they made it almost comical, but again with the flawed heroes. And that's Kelly's Heroes. It was a Clint Eastwood film from 1970 with Donald Sutherland, Telly Savalas, Don Rickles, Gavin MacLeod, and it's the same thing. They're in quest of Nazi gold, and these guys are connivers, and they're willing to do stuff. So that's that's the production of that was started in late '68 in Yugoslavia. So we're seeing that this propelled an interest in something along those lines within just a couple of years after its release in the United States.
So
And it did
let
draw
me beg,
25.
let me beg the question then. When was the Dirty Dozen, or which year?
65.
Okay, so it was 65? I
Yeah.
thought it was a little bit after that, because Jim Brown had just won the MVP in 65.
Yes, and the next year he retired because they had problems with the schedule and some rain. So he was 2 weeks overdue for training camp. So Paul Brown was fining him $100 a day or something like that. And so he just said, fine, I retire.
So the reason I ask that, and it's why I'm begging the question a little bit here, is this movie impactful because it basically gave us a leaping off point, or it was a movie that fit within where we were going already? If it's where we were going, how impactful is that? I mean, yes, maybe from a quality standpoint, that you saw what this genre could do when it came to fitting into the anti-hero culture or that concept, but is it as impactful as if, like, when we talk about Jaws, a lot of people say that's the pivot point for modern filmmaking. So that's where I'm having a hard time balancing between the two, and I understand your plight as well.
Well, and again, it's hard. You're asking to untangle the spaghetti, to use the metaphor from the film. Okay, it's difficult to say whether this was a significant factor in or became a factor because of culture. It's egg versus the chicken. Which came first? I can't tell you, even though I lived during that time that I was like 4 or 5 years of age. So I'm thinking about Sesame Street. Well, excuse me, Sesame Street wasn't on. I'm thinking about Captain Kangaroo and playing with my toy army men and Lincoln Logs. So I can't really say. But yet, like I said, I'm watching this film on network TV by the mid 70s. So there's more to it than that. And it did make $25 million. So, of course, so, so much of Hollywood was in transition. And the people who were writing the reviews were old Hollywood. They were the whole old Hollywood people who didn't understand and didn't like this concept. John Wayne absolutely hated this film because it was so anti what he believed a Western should be. And he believed in the clear good guy versus bad guy. And for a while, he swore that he would never work with Clint Eastwood because of it. So I think it had more impact than what you're giving it credit for, simply because the critics didn't understand it. And this transition period in the late 60s, 1967, when we had a whole broad range of In the Heat of the Night and The Graduate and all that was new Hollywood versus
Bonnie
old
and Clyde.
Hollywood. Yeah, Bonnie and Clyde and Dr. Doolittle. That I think that there was some aspect of it. So I went with a 3 on the industry side, and from a cultural side, I think there was more to it than that, and I think there was a significant number of people who watched the film and enjoyed the film who were coming out of the Western scene, and there were a lot of people who kind of got tired of Westerns, but for them, this was a renewal, something more tantalizing. So I went with 3.5 that there, so 6.5.
I don't know where you got your 25 million figure. The number that I had online was 6.3 million for the 60s. And then I went and checked that for today's dollars. That would be roughly 51.2 million box office. So I don't know if my figure's wrong or if yours is, but that's what I had done for my own, just as a
Yeah.
context maker there.
Well, I did my checking just to see how much money it had actually made or generated, and that's when I did my search. That's what I found. So I don't know.
Well, okay. Ali, let's bring you in. Impact significance for you.
Well, to be honest, this was a great discussion, but I think there are a lot of points there that I think. First of all, I agree that cinema at the 60s was in a transition period. Like, we had French New Wave movies in France, like Godard and all that BS. And you had in Hollywood, you had Roger Corman bringing up these seemingly unknown guys to work with him. Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, all of them are coming from Roger Corman's school. So cinema was in a peculiar state in the 60s. And I think it's more of a per right time, right place. At that time, a movie like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly could come and influence and bring a genre that nobody thought could work. I sort of like it to Fiddler on the Roof for musicals because musicals were dead until Fiddler on the Roof came and said, well, no, here it is. And so I came to impact and significance from what happened before and after this movie. Like, what was there before this movie and what happened after it. After it, you have the fact that Clint Eastwood became a star. He wasn't a star before that. He was Rawhide, which, to be honest, I watched and I didn't like. I like the theme song, but aside from that, I don't think it's a good show. And but after that, you have Clint Eastwood, international movie star. So that's kind of an immediate impact of it. So there is that part of it. So from an industry part, I accept and sort of understand that there was a lot of backlash. I agree with Dana that most of it came from people who were. I think it wasn't just a blind sort of traditionalism, I think it was fear too. This was new. This is coming to replace us, and it did. For the most part, spaghetti western completely changed the way that we watched westerns. Like Clint Eastwood came, and then came Terence Hill and Bud Spencer. Like we didn't go back to John Wayne, we came to those people, and then, well, Clint Eastwood himself became a director. But I put four and a half for the industry part because I think it did a lot of impact there. For the audience, it's kind of harder for me to say because, as I said, it's in a odd place in time. Everything was changing, so it's hard to see how much the immediate impact of the good, the bad, and the ugly was. I think the impact as a whole was for the Dollars trilogy rather than the good, the bad, and the ugly specifically. Even though I think it's the best movie in that trilogy, so I'm going to go with 4. So it's an 8.5 for me.
Okay. So the average between us then is an 6.83. And we move on to novelty. Dad, I'll let you go first. You're muted yet.
All right. Again, this is not, I mean, Western had been permeating Hollywood for decades, so that wasn't novel. And the counterculture had been slowly evolving. We mentioned The Dirty Dozen, there were other films, okay? This was the wedding of those two, and it had a lot of subtlety and created a lot of subtlety, as I said in the opening, where it showed good guys had bad qualities and bad guys had good qualities, and it kind of blurred the distinction between them, which was fairly novel. So, starting from where I usually do is at a 5 and then work up or down, the concept of blending and of showing the grayer areas of the characters was a novel. So I went with a 7 as a result of that.
Allie, what do you think?
I think I agree with Dana on all of those points that it was novel for the Western genre, it was novel for the time. The actors that were in it weren't really big names. I know Eli Wallach was nominated for an Oscar, but that was in the 40s. Like, he was not a big name then. And the last biggest westerns, which was the Magnificent Seven, it wasn't as big as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But the reason I'm not giving it a 10 out of 10, it's a 9 out of 10 for me, is the fact that Leone made 2 other movies with those same exact novelties in it, and they came before that. So even though I think The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the rise of what he was trying to do, like it was the best, like this was what he was building up to. The fact that he was building up to it, for anyone who was watching the trend, it was obvious we were going to get The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So it's a 9 out of 10 for me because Leone himself made it less novel, which is, I think, the best compliment I can give him.
I think that it's novel even within his own trilogy for how many characters you have pitted against each other. And again, I'll bring up the point. This is the most transitional of the three, where you get I think it's Fistful of Dollars is directly a takeoff of Yojimbo, the Kurosawa film. And that's a little bit more of a samurai film that's more akin to the westerns that would come after The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. To me, this is more of the transitional film, and so I give it more credence from a novelty perspective because this is the one. And again, going into the film, and even from the first couple of scenes, you get a clearly defined good guy that you know that's exactly who you're supposed to root for. You get a clearly defined bad guy, and then you get a clearly defined you don't know guy. Like, what is the ugly supposed to even mean? Is he supposed to be that much worse or more bad than anybody else? Well, not really, because Eli Wallach plays in such gray spaces through the course of the movie, and he gets the most screen time. It's the guy that's kind of like bumbling, stumbling his way through that could be evil, but could be good. And he kind of just goes and pivots back and forth through the course of the movie. And by the end of it, you're almost rooting for him. And so you're heartbroken that he's on the noose and standing on the gravestone or the cross at the end, because it can't end that way for the guy we're now really rooting for, even though, yes, Blondie had got the upper hand on everybody else. So I think with how he played out all of its characters, how unique it is even for Marconi scores because of the iconic nature of it and how blended it was. I've given a lot better novelty for something for just being the peak or epitome of what you think of in a particular thing. And then for spaghetti westerns, this is the peak of everything Leone did. Not that he did poorly with his other movies, but I think this is, for a reason, the one everybody immediately thinks of because it was just so good in all of its small pieces. All of those blended together did very well. So, surprisingly, I ended up going higher than both of you because I've been below both of you in the previous two categories. I went with a 9.5. I mean, how many westerns up to that point were simply about the pursuit of money instead of having the white hat pursue something with higher ideals and morals? I mean, this is quite literally a greed movie, as you both referred to. So the average between us with my 9.5 then is an 8.5 overall. Classicness. Always probably the most difficult category to score. So I'm going to leave it up to you first, Dad. Where did you come down?
Again, start with my 5 and work up or down. The subtleties, the basically portraying the American Civil War kind of almost neutral. There are no real good guys or bad guys in these. The only thing I could find is, and it's not a huge issue, is Eli Wallach playing a Mexican bandit. And that's always the problem. I mean, he did it more times than not, but he was a Jewish actor from New York. I gave it points down for that, so I went with an 8 for that.
Okay. I think that I give it slightly higher than you because as many times as I've watched this movie, all of the notes and all of the specific spots where you're supposed to feel the certain emotions work no matter how many times you've seen it. You still get the tension at the end. You still get the elation of the ecstasy of gold scene. You still get the highs and lows of every time somebody's hanging by a noose or there's a cannonball fired into something. All of those notes still work for me. So I ended up going with a 9. I knocked the only point off for the exact same reason that you did. It's only fair because we knocked it in The Magnificent Seven that Eli Wallach's playing a Mexican. He can't also be playing a Mexican bandit or a Latino bandit in this one and not get points reduced. So I ended up at a 9.
I forgot to add one other point, and that is, am I wrong? Is there only one female actress in the entire film?
No, because there's the wife on the burro outside,
Okay.
and then there's the
There is
prostitute.
Maria, the prostitute.
Yeah. Okay.
And isn't there the wife of the saloon owner in that one scene early on?
Yes.
So, but they're all very small bit parts.
Yeah. So this is a very testosterone driven film.
Leone sort of redeems it by Once Upon a Time in the West. He makes the main character a strong female character, Claudia Cardinale in Once Upon a Time in the West. But yeah, it's a problem with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I sort of give it historical leeway because most cowboys probably were men. But again, I'm not a good authority on that, so it never jumped up at me. Maybe because this is what I expected of westerns.
Well, also, to be fair, it would be kind of an odd look for this movie to have a Cat Ballou character.
Yeah. So for me, for classicness, again, this is my most zealous. I do understand why Eli Wallach playing a Mexican bandit is not good. To be honest, maybe because I'm seeing it from such away from outside, I didn't really notice he was Mexican until like the 10th time I watched it. I was like, yeah, he talks odd, but I didn't think he was Mexican until I said, oh yeah, Ramirez is a Mexican last name. So again, I think of it as he wasn't trying to do it sort of a stereotypical way, I always compare it to the worst example of it, which I know you mentioned, is the Mickey Rooney character from Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is I can't watch that movie, even though I kind of like the movie. I can't watch it anymore because it makes me so uncomfortable. So it's not that bad, but I do understand it. But for me, the classicness of it is the fact that I think it's quintessential Western. Like when I say the word Western, my mind quickly goes the good, the bad, and the ugly. Then it says, oh, yeah, but there is all of these others. But the first thing I think about when I hear Western is the good, the bad, and the ugly. I watched it 40 times, the recent one being a couple of days ago for the podcast, and I still yelled yes when Tuco and Blondie team up. So it's for me, it's a 10 out of 10. I still get all of the same feeling. All of the shortcomings for me become kind of forgivable by how good it does all of the other stuff.
So that is an easy math problem for me. An 8, a 9, and a 10 become a 9 in the average. Rewatchability. Allie, we always give this to our guest first. Rewatchability for you, a 10 out of 10? No suspense?
It's a 10 out of 10. It's I watched it 40 times. I think even after recording this podcast, I probably will go and watch it another time because it makes me just feel so good about myself.
I don't know if I've ever thought of that about a movie, but sure, okay, I can buy it. For me, it's a 7.5. It's a little bit long in spots, and I do find it a tad bit slow where I think maybe it could be cut slightly strategically, maybe about 10 minutes out of this. Even the opening to me is just a little slow, and there are a couple of other spots, particularly around the prison camp, maybe a little strung out for me, as well as just before they're going to blow up the bridge. They kind of elongated a little bit too much. I understand why he does it, and be it from me to criticize the great Sergio Leone, but it's a little bit too much for me to sit through a 3 hour film at times. And this is me who constantly sits through long stuff all the time. But I think that a lot of movies get a little overlong than they need to be, and you have to have the right director to make a 3 or 3.5 or 4 hour movie watchable so that you're not out of it by about the 2 hour mark. So this is better than most of those, but I haven't probably rewatched this as much as I should have. But simply put, last weekend when I was watching this, I couldn't help but be engrossed and just waiting, anticipating that final scene. Yes, it took 2.5 hours to get to that final 20 minutes, but it's worth it when you get there. So I probably should rewatch this more than I have. I gave it a 7.5 because it's probably not one of my most rewatchable movies, but it probably should be. Dad, where'd you come down?
7.5. My standard is 8 is something I'll put on if I'm just really just need to sit and do nothing and just relax, or have something on that I really just want to vegetate. And I go down to about between 7 and an 8 if it's something that I really enjoy and I need to have it on my regular list to review or watch periodically, because it is food for my cinematic soul. So I had that. The only thing is you have to have the commitment for the 3 hours. You almost want to break it up into two parts and do it, because it just, with my schedule and such, it's just difficult. And so that's why I went with a 7.5.
So, just recapping for everyone, that was a 8.33 for the average on rewatchability. So we had a 9.17 average for legacy, a 6.83 average for impact significance. We had an 8.5 for novelty, 9 average for classicness, an 8.33 rewatchability average, and audience score. This is a 93% for Google users. It is a 97% for Rotten Tomato users, giving us a 9.5. All told and added up, that makes it a 51.33, and currently slots in between Some Like It Hot and Wall-E. All right. Any remaining questions, gentlemen?
Well, for me, the biggest one is how is Tuco gonna survive? It's a cemetery in the middle of nowhere, and his hands are tied.
My other thought was, and I don't even know how you'd adjust for inflation, but if you even put it as far back as we go, and I've looked at a couple of the calculators, $200,000 from, I would guess this is probably what, 1864, 63 to now, you're talking about probably that equivalent in millions of dollars. So this is like $200 million. How do you spend all of that? Like, what does Blondie become? Does he like own his own town? That's a shit ton of money.
There is this thing also that I know it wasn't what Leone intended, but the Dollar Trilogy, if you look at it chronologically, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the prequel. Like, it's the first one. Like, A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More are after that. What happened with all those monies? Like, you got the poncho, but where did the money go? Where is the money, Lebowski?
Yeah. All right. Allie, before we go, where can people find you if they want to hear more of your work or anything that you'd like to promote?
Well, I do have a couple of projects. One of them is a podcast that I have with my friend where we talk about nerdy stuff, video games, and TV shows each episode. It's called YASP, YASP exclamation point. It's short for Yet Another Shitty Podcast. And our latest episode is about Over the Garden Wall, the Cartoon Network miniseries. So you can find us on your podcast application of choice. We upload it on Anchor, so that's our main hub if you want to search for us there. And I do have a YouTube channel myself. It's been on a year-long hiatus, but I'm bringing it back. And even as I'm speaking, the update video has gone up, and I'm bringing a pretty big project up fairly soon. It's AK88 Studios, and it's on YouTube. You can search for it. There was a show there that has finished. It's called Born in Quarantine. I give you three guesses when I filmed that. And so it's finished now, but I'm bringing up a new show, and I hope to just see you there.
Again, thank you for joining us. I know I'll speak for Dana on this front, but we're very glad that we've had as many talented and wonderful guests like yourself over the past couple of months. We've had a lot of them, but we're glad anytime we can find fellow movie lovers, connoisseurs, and people that just love to talk about their favorites. So thank you again for being on.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank for your kindness and understanding. And well, thank you for making me rewatch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and making me feel so good throughout the week.
You're very welcome. You're welcome back anytime. Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we are revisiting the movie that we began the show with for its 40th anniversary this year, Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Harrison Ford, Karen Allen, and John Rhys Davies. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram @GMotePodcast, or find Dana or I or the show on Twitter @TJ3Duncan, @DanaWDuncan, or @GMotePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.